The hammer had already begun to fall. Dust hung motionless in the heat-soaked air of Dry Creek's main street, as if time itself was holding its breath. On the auction platform, two small children stood barefoot and still, their hands locked so tight their knuckles had turned white. No one in the crowd said a word. They just stared. And then, "Stop! I'll buy those twins." The voice was gravel-deep and loud enough to cut through dust, heat, and silence. Heads turned, boots shuffled. All eyes landed on the massive figure at the edge of the crowd. Gideon Hart stepped forward, tall as a mountain and twice as solid. His brown hat cast a long shadow over a face weathered by years in the high country. A dark brown vest clung to his broad shoulders, and his gloved hands moved with slow certainty as he untied his coin pouch from his belt. "I said I'll buy them," he repeated. Horace Brigg, the saloon keeper and auctioneer, narrowed his beady eyes. His silk vest strained over a belly grown fat from profits that never saw daylight. "Now, hold on there," Brigg barked, trying to keep the authority in his voice steady. "This is a legal auction under territorial ordinance. These children are wards of the court, and we—" Gideon didn't so much as blink. He walked past the sheriff, past the stunned townsfolk, straight up to the wooden platform, his boots thudding hard against the planks. "How much?" he asked. Sheriff Matthews, standing stiff and silent until now, cleared his throat. "Bid started at $20. No one met it." Gideon reached into the pouch and counted out silver coins, placing them one by one into the sheriff's outstretched hand. "That enough?" The sheriff looked to Brigadier. Brigg looked back at the sheriff. No one said anything. Finally, Matthews nodded. "It's enough." Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind in tall grass. A few turned their heads, ashamed. A few others looked openly curious, but none stepped forward. Gideon turned to the children. Up close, they looked even smaller. The boy stood slightly in front of the girl, a twitch in his jaw like he was daring someone to come at them. The girl's eyes were wide and dark, not crying, not trembling, just watching. He crouched slowly, setting his hat aside, trying not to tower over them. "My name's Gideon," he said. "I've got a horse and a wagon. I came into town to trade, not to buy children. But I saw you standing here, and I can't walk away from that." The boy didn't answer. His hand clutched the girl's tighter, but she tilted her head slightly. "Both of us?" she asked, her voice as soft as wind through pine. "Both of you," Gideon said. The girl looked at her brother. He gave a single, reluctant nod. "Okay," she whispered. Gideon stood and reached for them. They didn't run, didn't cry. They let themselves be lifted into his arms, light as bird bones. As he turned toward his horse, he felt the full weight of every pair of eyes behind him. He didn't look back. He didn't care. Until Horace Brigg shouted, "You think kindness makes you a father, mountain man? You'll come crawling back once they start crying in the night." Gideon stopped just long enough to look over his shoulder. "I've faced grizzlies. Storms that froze men dead in their boots. And I buried my wife and son with my own 2 hands. I reckon I can handle a little crying." The sheriff didn't speak, but his face softened. By the time Gideon reached his wagon, the children were quiet, watching everything. He settled them into the saddle, both sitting sideways in front of him, his arms braced around them to keep them steady. The boy reached out and touched the mane of the big chestnut gelding. "What's his name?" he asked. "Thunder." The boy nodded. "Good name." They rode through the center of town, past the mercantile, the barber's, the saloon. Folks parted, some silent, some staring, some shaking their heads. Only one spoke. "Mr. Hart," said a woman from the bakery, wiping flour from her hands. "Those little ones need shoes." "And you look like you could use a hot meal," he tipped his head. Much obliged, Mrs. Peterson. By the time they reached the edge of town, Gideon could feel a change in the girl against his chest. Her shoulders had eased just a little. She leaned her head back, her cheek brushing his coat. She whispered, "Are you our paw now?" The question struck him like lightning. His throat tightened. He couldn't speak, couldn't lie, couldn't tell the truth. He just held them tighter as thunder carried them into the dusk and away from the place where no one else had raised a hand, and behind them, in the quiet dust of Dry Creek, Kane was already watching. The room above the Dry Creek Mercantile wasn't much bare walls. A narrow stove, one cot against the far wall. But to Gideon Hart, it felt like the safest place in the territory for the two small souls sitting on the edge of the bed, too quiet for children their age. He knelt by the stove, feeding kindling into the iron belly and striking a match. The flame caught slowly, stubbornly, then flared. The soft crackle of fire brought a whisper of warmth to the space. Behind him, the twins sat huddled together, knees drawn up, bare feet dangling over the wooden floor. Their clothes still carried the dust of the auction platform, and their faces looked thinner in the glow of firelight. "You hungry?" he asked gently, not turning yet. There was no answer, just a rustle of fabric and the faint squeak of the bed springs. Gideon stood and moved to his pack, pulling out a bundle of jerky and a tin wrapped in cloth. "Ain't much," he said, slicing off pieces of dried venison and placing them on two mismatched tin plates. "But it'll fill your bellies." The boy reached first, the girl followed, slower. She didn't thank him, but she gave him a look, measured, quiet, deep. He'd seen eyes like that before, eyes that had watched too much, carried too much. They ate slowly, chewing with the careful attention of children who'd learned not to waste anything. Gideon pulled out a wool blanket from his supplies, shook the trail dust off, and wrapped it around them both. The girl leaned into it with a quiet sigh. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked at him, then over at the boy, who kept his eyes on his plate. "I'm Little Bird," she said, voice so soft he almost missed it. The boy didn't answer. She nudged him gently. He glanced up, uncertain, then whispered, "Samuel." Gideon nodded. "Good names." He poured hot water into a tin cup and handed it to Little Bird. Her hands trembled as she accepted it, trying not to spill. Outside, the last light of day vanished. A heavy stillness settled over the town. From the saloon down the street, the faint twang of a fiddle drifted on the wind, but up here there was only the pop of firewood and the weight of 3 strangers in a room built for one. Gideon set a pot of water on the stove, tore a clean rag from an old shirt, and offered it to the girl. "You want to wash up a little?" She hesitated, then nodded. He turned his back, giving them space as they cleaned their faces and hands. When he turned around again, the dirt was mostly gone, revealing young skin stretched too thin over sharp cheekbones. Their eyes never stopped watching him. He cleared his throat. "I ain't done this before," he admitted. "Raising young ones." "Never planned to." The girl stared. "You had a boy once." It wasn't a question. He swallowed. "Yes, ma'am. Long time ago." She didn't ask what happened. Just nodded slowly and scooted closer to her brother. Gideon stoked the fire. "We'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." A knock at the door made them all jump. Gideon rose fast, hand near his belt. He hadn't carried a pistol into town, hadn't needed to, but now he regretted it. The knock came again, sharp, measured. He walked to the door and opened it just enough to see. A man stood in the hallway, tall and lean, dressed in a black wool coat and matching hat. His boots were polished, his mustache trimmed too fine for a man who rode trails. There was an Eastern sharpness to his face, lawyer, or worse. "Evening," the man said. "Name's Kane. I represent the Western Pacific Railroad Company." Gideon didn't move. Not buying anything. I'm not here to sell, Kane replied smoothly. I'm here regarding those two children in your room. Behind Gideon, he felt the twins go still. Not a sound, but he could sense their fear rising like cold water. Kane's eyes flicked past him toward the firelight inside. They were found on railroad property, Kane said. Specifically, a claim formerly worked by Thomas Gilroy, now abandoned, and legally under company domain. Those children were trespassing. Squatting. Under territorial law, they fall under government jurisdiction. I bought them, Gideon said flatly. Paid cash. Sheriff saw it. Kane smiled, polite and dry. Auctions like that? Legally murky, especially when children of mixed blood are involved. There are procedures, Mr. Hart. Forms. Hearings. Gideon didn't flinch. You here to take them? Kane raised both hands, mock conciliatory. Of course not. Not tonight. But I suggest you start gathering documentation if you wish to make any kind of guardianship claim. We wouldn't want the company forced to intervene. Kane's smile never touched his eyes. You've got, let's say, a week. After that, this matter will be transferred to federal jurisdiction. He tipped his hat. Good night, Mr. Hart. Gideon shut the door and stood there, hand still resting on the wood as the man's footsteps faded. Behind him, Little Bird whispered, He works for the men who hurt Mama. Gideon turned. Her eyes were dry. Her brother had crawled under the cot, curled tight. Gideon didn't know what to say. He pulled the blanket tighter around them both, then sat down on the floor beside the bed, back to the stove. You're safe now, he said quietly. The fire burned lower. The town outside went still. A few minutes passed, and then a small hand reached down and wrapped itself around his. He looked up. Little Bird didn't say a word. She just held his thumb tight in her tiny palm like an anchor. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Just let her hold on. And that's how he stayed the rest of the night, his big frame curled beside the cot, her fingers never loosening their grip, not even as sleep claimed her. He watched the fire die down, the coals glowing soft orange, and made himself a silent promise. No one, no man in a black coat, no law with fine letters, no railroad with deep pockets was ever going to take those children from him. But Gideon Hart had been in too many fights to believe this would be one with promises. And as dawn neared, he realized he'd need help, the kind of help that might come from the last person he ever thought he'd trust again. Dry Creek's morning was slow to stir, but Gideon Hart had been awake since before first light. He'd sat through the dark with a sleeping child's fingers wrapped around his thumb and another curled tight beneath the cot. As the coals in the stove cooled, so did the stillness in his chest. Something had changed, the kind of change a man doesn't plan for and can't outrun. Now, with the sun creeping up over the rooftops, Gideon stood on the front step of a modest white house near the edge of town, his wide-brimmed hat in hand. The house stood proud, freshly painted, with neat shutters and a small garden where winter greens clung to life. It looked like it belonged to someone who kept order when the world tried to unravel. The front door opened before he could knock. "You're Mr. Hart," the woman said. Not asked, stated. She looked him over with clear, steady eyes, late 30s, maybe 40. Her dark hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense braid streaked with early silver. She wore a plain blue dress and a shawl wrapped around her shoulders like armor. She wasn't beautiful in the way of dime novel heroines, but there was something in her posture dignity. Maybe that made him feel like a schoolboy caught tracking mud inside. "Eliza Banning," she said, "school teacher." "I know," Gideon replied. "Mrs. Peterson said you might be the kind to help." Her gaze flicked down to the dusty footprints behind him. The twins? At the mercantile. sleeping still. They had a rough day. She stepped back from the door. Come inside. We'll talk, he ducked beneath the doorframe, suddenly all too aware of how much space he took up. The house was warm and smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood smoke. Books lined the shelves, real ones, too, not the kind for show. Coffee? She asked. Ma'am, if you have it. She poured 2 cups and motioned for him to sit. He chose the chair closest to the stove, still wearing yesterday's trail-dusted clothes, knees bent awkwardly in the small space. Tell me everything, she said, settling across from him, with her own cup cradled between her hands. He did. Not all of it, but enough. The auction, the children's condition, the way the girl clung to him, the railroad man's threats. He didn't speak much about the way his chest had cracked open at the sound of that little voice, asking if he was their pa. Some things a man couldn't put into words, not even for a woman like this. When he finished, Eliza set her cup down carefully. They were born to a woman named Morning Star, Gideon added. Apache, far as I can tell. Their father might have worked the rails, her brows knit together. If their parents were legally married, that's the thing. I don't know. And Kane, he's the one pushing to take them, he says without guardianship papers. They're just squatters on railroad land. Eliza rose and crossed to the bookshelf. Her fingers danced across spines until she pulled down a ledger and flipped through the pages. Reverend Clark keeps records of every church marriage he performs, she said. But the old records go back further. There's a chest in the church basement. Marriage certificates, baptismal logs, notes on blessings. If their father was married in town, we might find proof Gideon stood. I'll ride out now. No, Eliza said firmly. Not today. The twins need rest. You need clean clothes. And if you go tramping into that church looking like a bear that's been chased out of a mine shaft, Reverend Clark might not take you seriously. He blinked. Ma'am, are you offering to wash me? She didn't smile, but her eyes sparkled. I'm offering to help you not scare the pastor out of his britches. She returned with a bundle of neatly folded boys' clothing and a small dress. Belonged to my niece and nephew. Both grown now. You'll find a tub and soap out back. Use the pump. I'll stop by the mercantile in an hour. The children can wash there. Gideon held the clothes carefully. I'm obliged. Eliza paused in the doorway. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for them. He nodded. That makes 2 of us. The bath was cold, the soap rough, but when Gideon returned to the room above the mercantile, his beard trimmed and clothes fresh, Little Bird stared at him like he was someone new. Samuel peeked out from behind a blanket, eyes wide. You look different. Clean, Gideon said. For once. They laughed, just a little, but it was a real sound and it made his chest ache. Later that morning, Eliza arrived with a fresh loaf of bread, a basket of boiled eggs, and 2 sets of proper clothes. She greeted the children softly, no questions, no fuss. Little Bird studied her with quiet curiosity. Samuel clung to Gideon's leg, but didn't pull away when Eliza handed him a wooden comb. They washed up behind a curtain while Eliza helped pour water, and Gideon fumbled with buttons. When the children stepped out in clean clothes and combed hair, the room changed. Just a little, like it was no longer borrowed, but borrowed with purpose. Eliza brought out a book from her bag, pictures of animals and simple words. I teach letters in the schoolhouse, she said, crouching beside them. Would you like to learn? Little Bird nodded slowly. Samuel shrugged. Reading's useful, Gideon added. Might help us later on. They sat at the small table hunched over the book, Eliza guiding their fingers over each letter. Gideon watched from the corner, arms crossed, pretending not to care. Samuel looked up at one point and whispered something to Little Bird. She nodded. Then the boy turned to Gideon and said quietly, Pa, what's this word? The room went still. Eliza looked up. Her breath caught. Gideon's throat worked, but he didn't speak. He just stepped forward, crouched beside the table, and pointed at the word with his large, scarred finger. "That's horse," he said. Samuel nodded, and Eliza Banning, who had built her life around silence and routine, felt something shift inside her. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew this man wasn't just protecting these children. He was becoming theirs. And Cain. Cain wasn't going to take them without a fight. The back room of Dry Creek's church smelled of paper, dust, and faint candle wax. Sunlight angled through narrow stained glass windows, painting slivers of color across the worn floorboards. Eliza Banning stood in the center of it all, sleeves rolled to her elbows, scanning fragile pages with sharp eyes and a growing sense of urgency. Gideon Hart leaned against a crooked shelf nearby, arms folded, boots planted, trying to keep still in a room not built for men his size. His shoulders brushed every beam, and the reverent hush of the church made him feel like he might break something just by breathing too hard. "How many more books?" he asked. Eliza didn't look up. "This is the last of the old marriage ledgers." Reverend Clark kept separate books for each decade. "If they're not in here, we'll have to think of another angle." He exhaled, shifting his weight. "They were married. Little Bird talks about her mother like she was someone who lit fires right, someone who taught her how to braid her brother's hair so it'd lie flat. That's not the kind of detail a child invents." Eliza agreed, still flipping pages. "But Cain won't care about memory, he'll want ink." Outside the church walls, bells chimed faintly from the mercantile down the road. Morning commerce had begun. Somewhere in town, men drank coffee too hot, and horses snorted into the cold air. But here, in the shadow of crossbeams and faith, something heavier filled the space. Something like hope, stretched thin. Eliza's finger stopped. "Here," she said softly. Gideon stepped forward. The page was dated 5 years back. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the handwriting was clean and deliberate. Thomas Gilroy, it read, married to Morning Star of the Apache people, witnessed and officiated by Reverend Emery Clark. Gideon's eyes scanned every line. "That's them," he said. "It has to be." "There's a note," Eliza murmured, pointing. "Bride baptized in the church the day before. Ceremony public, attended by 2 railroad witnesses." "That's important." She looked up, her voice steadier now. "This proves the children are legitimate. Citizens. Their mother may be Apache, but she was married under territorial law in a Christian church." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Cain won't like it." Eliza closed the book carefully, as if afraid it might vanish. "That's the point," she said. "He doesn't have to like it. The law's supposed to be stronger than personal opinion." They made a copy of the record together, Eliza writing each word carefully on heavy paper while Gideon watched the church door. When they stepped outside, the town had warmed. Dust swirled lazily on the street, and somewhere a blacksmith hammered iron with slow rhythm. Then Gideon stopped cold. Across the street, just outside the saloon, stood Horace Brigg and Mr. Cain. Between them, a third man wore a worn cavalry coat and carried the stiff posture of military training. Gideon's eyes narrowed. "That's Sergeant Barnes," he said under his breath. "Used to run patrols out by the Verde line." The sergeant leaned against the hitching post, listening as Cain spoke in low tones. Briggs stood nearby, nodding, grinning in that oily way of his, like he was already counting a payoff. Eliza stiffened beside Gideon. Why would Cain be speaking to a cavalry officer? "You know why." Gideon's voice was low, measured, dangerous. "He's laying the groundwork. Probably whispering about illegal custody, about children being at risk. If he gets the army involved, there'll be no slow proceedings. They'll come with orders. She followed his gaze, watching the way Cain gestured toward the church with one gloved hand. He's already told them we're trying to play the system. We ain't, Gideon said, but it won't matter. Not to men who serve ink and gold, Cain turned then, as if sensing their eyes. He locked onto Gideon across the street and gave a slight nod. Not polite, not respectful, just acknowledgement. Briggs smirked. Gideon's fists curled. I don't like that look. Neither do I, Eliza said, but what matters now is what we do next. They started walking again, slower now. She glanced up at him, voice low. This record's not enough on its own. Not if they're bringing soldiers into it. We'll need the town, the community, people who'll stand up in front of Cain and say, these children belong here. They're family. He looked down at her. That's asking a lot from folks who looked away while kids were being sold on a platform. Maybe, she said, but you gave them a reason to look back. They turned down a quieter lane toward the mercantile. In the distance, he could just make out the faint sound of Little Bird's laugh. Thin, uncertain, but still real. It twisted in his chest. That laugh didn't belong in a barracks or an orphanage. It belonged by a fire, under a quilt, in a home. Eliza touched his arm. We have to be faster than them, she whispered, and we have to be louder. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, You think they'll listen? She nodded. They'll listen if they see you with those children. If they see what I see, Gideon stared back down the street, where Cain and Brigg had disappeared, into the saloon, the cavalry sergeant not far behind. Then we better get started, he said. Eliza adjusted the folded document in her satchel. Yes, she replied, because if Cain's building a case with the law, we're going to need something stronger, something they can't ignore. And what's that? She met his eyes. A town that remembers what it means to do the right thing. Dry Creek was quiet that morning, but Gideon could feel something shifting beneath the surface, like the hush before a storm, or maybe before a stand. He stood in the kitchen of Eliza Banning's white house, listening as she paced the worn floorboards, hands clasped tight around the marriage certificate copy. We need a town meeting, she said, turning to face him. Not next week. Not later now. Gideon set his coffee cup down. You think folks'll come just because we ask? I think, she said, if they look into the eyes of those children, they'll remember who they are. He didn't answer right away. The fire in the stove popped. From the next room came the soft scratch of chalk as Little Bird tried to teach Samuel how to write his name on a slate board. Eliza stepped closer. This isn't just about Cain or the railroad anymore. This is about whether or not this town can still tell right from wrong. He stared out the window. You sure they'll listen to a mountain man with rough hands and 2 half-Apache children clinging to his side? You're not asking them to listen to you, she said gently. You're asking them to listen to themselves. Later that morning, they began their rounds. First stop was the general store. Mrs. Whitaker raised an eyebrow when they walked in, but Little Bird immediately curtsied, and Samuel nodded with both hands behind his back. Good manners, Mrs. Whitaker muttered, glancing at Eliza. Cain said they were wild things. Wild doesn't say please and thank you, Eliza replied. They deserve more than what's being threatened. Mrs. Whitaker hesitated, then nodded once. I'll come to the meeting. At the blacksmith's, Tom Peterson looked up from his forge, sweat on his brow, hammer mid-swing. Samuel took one look at the tools and lit up with questions. Little Bird asked if she could help sweep the floor. By the time they left, Tom had promised them a stool near the fire and a shoeing lesson if they came back. I'll be there, he told Gideon. Cain's been throwing his weight around too long anyhow. They moved through town one house at a time. The baker, the livery stable owner, even old man Jenkins, who hadn't stepped into a church since his wife passed, nodded solemnly when Little Bird handed him a hand-drawn flower and told him it was for his porch. Some folks were hesitant. A few closed their doors, but more opened them than Gideon expected. People remembered that auction day, the silence, the shame. They remembered the cowboy who'd stepped forward when no one else had, and now they saw the children not as some political problem, but as what they were, two kids who needed safety and love. By midday, they had a list of names, verbal promises, cautious affirmations, nods at the end of driveways. Gideon didn't quite believe it, but Eliza did. As they walked back toward the schoolhouse where Eliza had set up chalk lessons for the twins, Gideon found himself watching Little Bird skip just ahead, her bare feet light on the dusty road. Samuel was holding his hand now, unprompted. Gideon looked down at the boy's small fingers wrapped around his own calloused ones, and something caught in his throat. "She's smiling more," Eliza said beside him. "That means she feels safe. She still doesn't sleep through the night." No, but neither do most children who've seen the world turn ugly. They reached the schoolhouse steps and paused. Gideon looked around at the town, the creaking signs, the dusty hitching posts, the sunlight on the old church bell. This place hadn't changed, but maybe the people inside it could. That afternoon, Eliza pinned a notice on the front of the Mercantile. Town meeting, Wednesday at 2. Church Hall, a matter of justice and family. By evening, the wind picked up, tugging at the paper edges. Gideon returned to the Mercantile room to find the children sleeping, their cheeks pink from sun, their arms tangled together beneath the quilt. He sat near the window, rifle across his lap, watching the street below. And that's when the knock came. Not hurried, not loud, just official. He opened the door to find Deputy Miller standing stiff on the landing, an envelope in his hand. "Evening, Mr. Hart." Miss Banning Gideon nodded. "Deputy, I've been asked to deliver this." From Fort Verde. He handed over the envelope, tugged at his hat, and stepped away without further word. Gideon tore the seal. Eliza read over his shoulder. Her face grew pale. By order of the Territorial Command, the minors known as Little Bird and Samuel Gilroy are to be placed in federal custody within 3 days unless contested by legal guardianship through certified channels. Gideon lowered the paper slowly. The room felt colder than it had a minute ago. "They're not waiting anymore," he said. "Cain's lit the fire." Now the armies watching Eliza folded her arms across her chest. "Then we better have that town meeting." Gideon looked over at the children, still sleeping under the patchwork quilt. He wouldn't let them wake to a world where someone came and took them away. No, not again. Not ever. It was still dark when the knock came. 3 quick taps against the back door of Eliza's cottage. Gideon had been up for hours, sitting near the window, eyes fixed on the narrow road that ran west out of town. The letter from Fort Verde lay folded in his coat pocket, creased from being read too many times. He opened the door without a word. Sergeant Barnes stood in the shadows, uniform dusted with trail dirt, hat pulled low. His face looked older than it had 2 days ago. "Sorry to come this way," the sergeant muttered, stepping inside. "Didn't want eyes on me." Eliza lit a lamp low and set it on the kitchen table. The flame flickered between them, throwing long shadows on the wall. "You said you had something," Gideon said. "You'd better say it quick." Barnes removed his gloves, then rubbed a hand over his jaw. "I've seen this before. Mixed-blood children caught between law and land. Paperwork twists like a snake. But there's one thing that can hold if it's done right." Eliza crossed her arms. "What thing?" "Church adoption," Barnes said. Under territorial code, if a child is baptized and declared under the protection of a guardian, and that guardian is recorded in the parish registry, it holds weight, real legal weight, even over military order. But it has to be done before the government officially takes custody. Gideon's brow furrowed. You're saying a priest can give me rights that the law won't? In certain cases, Barnes said, especially when it's a mission recognized by both the church and the territorial court. There's one man I trust to do it right. Father Mendoza runs a mission out west, past the canyon road. Gideon didn't hesitate. How far? Day's ride by wagon if you don't stop. Rough country. Soldiers'll leave Verde by sunup 3 days from now. You've got maybe 40 hours. Then we leave tonight, Gideon said. Barnes shifted uneasily. You didn't hear this from me? I didn't, Gideon said flatly. Barnes nodded, then turned to leave. Before he reached the door, he paused. Those kids deserve more than what this territory's offering, he said. And you, he looked at Gideon. You're the first man I've seen fight for 'em like they matter. Then he was gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn dark. Gideon turned to Eliza. We need the wagon ready by sundown. She didn't argue. She just moved. Within the hour, they had blankets rolled, jars of preserves packed, and water barrels strapped tight in the back. Gideon double-checked the rifle, then saddled Thunder to ride ahead of the wagon if needed. The twins were still asleep when they finished. Eliza stood at the edge of their room, watching their small chests rise and fall beneath the quilt. They'll need warm coats, she said softly. It gets colder near the canyon. And something for their feet. I'll trade with Jake Miller, Gideon said. He's got boots for his boys. Might still fit. He turned to her. You don't have to come. Eliza looked at him like he'd lost his mind. I don't leave children to fight battles alone, she said. That was all. At dusk, the wagon was ready. Gideon tied Thunder to the rear for rest rotation. The sky turned a bruised purple as stars began to blink to life overhead. They waited until the saloon grew loud, until Kane and Brigg would be too deep in whiskey to notice. Eliza woke the children gently. Samuel blinked sleep from his eyes. Little Bird sat up fast, sensing urgency before words were said. We're going on a trip, Gideon told them, just for a little while. Samuel reached for his boots, still half asleep. Little Bird crawled across the bed and put her hands on Gideon's shoulders. Are they coming to take us? He met her gaze square. No, he said, but we're going to make sure they never can. That night, they slipped out the back road west, past the fence line behind the Petersons' lot, where no one ever looked. The wagon creaked, but the wheels had been greased and the horses moved smooth over the dirt. Dry Creek fell behind them like a ghost in the mist. The road was dark, unlit but familiar. The high desert stretched out like a whispering sea, sage and dust wrapping around them as Eliza held the children close beneath wool quilts. Gideon drove in silence, listening for hoofbeats that didn't come. The only sound was the soft creak of wood, the occasional chirp of a nightbird, and the wind threading through canyon grass. After an hour, Samuel poked his head out from under the blanket. "Pa?" he asked, voice sleepy and low. Gideon looked over his shoulder. Yeah, Samuel crawled forward on his knees and nestled into his lap. Little Bird followed a moment later, arms wrapped around his side like a second thought. He didn't say anything. He just pulled the reins with one hand and laid the other gently across their shoulders, where it stayed. Eliza watched from the wagon bed, her shawl drawn tight, heart beating hard against her ribs. Not from fear, from something deeper, something she hadn't felt since her husband passed. Hope. They rode through the night with no lanterns, no campfire, just stars above, wagon wheels beneath, and a silence thick with purpose. Ahead, the trail would get steeper, colder. Behind them, orders had been signed and sealed, but right now wrapped in wool and the whisper of "paw" on a boy's breath. Gideon Hart held his family close and pointed them toward the one man who might give them the future they'd been denied. And in the east, far behind the ridgeline, the soldiers were already saddling their horses. The road narrowed into pine and dust by midnight. Dry Creek was long behind them, just a memory swallowed by moonlight and distance. The wagon moved slow but steady, wheels crunching through soft shale and broken twigs, guided by Gideon's steady hands and the quiet breath of the desert. They were less than 10 miles from the mission when the horses jerked to a halt. "What is it?" Eliza whispered. Gideon stepped down, lantern in hand. The beam caught a massive tangle of limbs and splintered wood, an entire cottonwood tree, thick as a wagon axle, stretched across the road like the arm of God. Gideon narrowed his eyes. The tree hadn't just fallen, it had been cut clean, not by lightning or storm. The edge was too sharp, the break too fresh. His jaw clenched. "Someone did this on purpose," he muttered. Eliza climbed down, lifting Little Bird with her while Samuel stayed wrapped under the quilts. "Cain?" Gideon didn't answer. He was already reaching for the axe. It took the better part of 2 hours. They worked by the dull yellow of the lantern, Gideon swinging steady while Eliza hauled away limbs. Little Bird tried to help, dragging brush as big as herself. Samuel tied smaller branches with twine, his fingers numb from cold but never complaining. Sweat mixed with dust and pine sap. The silence of the night pulsed with unseen urgency, and somewhere behind them, far beyond the hills, the ground was waking with hooves. By the time they pushed the last log aside, the moon had dropped below the ridge, and the first light of dawn broke pale and slow across the peaks. That's when they heard it. Not the bird song, not the wind. Hoofbeats. Eliza turned, blood draining from her face. A thin column of dust spiraled into the air far behind them, then another. 5, maybe 6 riders, uniforms glinting in the rising sun. "They found us," she breathed. Gideon didn't speak. He climbed back onto the wagon, cracked the reins hard, and veered the team left off the main road and down into the lower ravine where fog still clung like smoke over the ground. "Where are we going?" Eliza called. "Old trapping trails," Gideon shouted back. "They won't know them." "But I do." The wagon bumped and groaned, wheels screaming against rocks. Branches slapped across the canvas top, and the children clung to each other, wide-eyed but silent. They passed through a curtain of brush, then dropped into a dry wash that twisted like a serpent through the lowland. Gideon dismounted, letting Eliza drive as he ran alongside, slapping the horses' flanks, guiding them through tight bends and sudden drops. Fog wrapped around them, blinding and cold. More than once they nearly tipped, but Eliza held steady, her face pale and determined. At one crossing, the wagon's rear wheel slipped into a gully. Gideon threw his shoulder against it, straining until his boots dug deep into the mud. With one final shout, the wheel popped free. They kept moving. Hours passed. The sound of the riders faded and returned, always like a breath on their necks. Sometimes close, sometimes far, but always there. At a rocky outcrop, Gideon paused. Below, through the haze, the mission bell tower stood whitewashed and weathered, half obscured by fog. "We're close," he said. They pressed on, following a trail no wider than a mule's back, with cliffs on one side and thorns on the other. Gideon walked beside the wagon now, one hand steady on Little Bird's back. Samuel had taken the reins without being asked. They didn't speak of fear, only of what came next. "Do you think the priest will be nice?" Samuel asked. Eliza nodded. "He's kind. He helped families like ours before." "Are we a family?" he asked. No one answered right away. Then Little Bird looked up and said, "You call him Paw. That's family." They reached the ridge as the sun began its slow descent. The mission bell rang once deep and low, echoing through the hills like a heartbeat. But behind them came another sound. Bugles and hooves. Gideon turned. The ridge above lit with dust and steel cavalry riders, uniforms stiff and blue, moving fast. "We're out of time," he said. He leapt onto Thunder, cut the reins from the wagon, and shouted, "Get to the chapel!" The mission gates came into view just as the wagon reached the clearing. A priest stepped out, startled. Gideon swung off the saddle and lifted both children in his arms. Eliza grabbed the baptism papers from her coat and ran. The priest looked at them, at the riders behind them, and stepped aside. Inside the chapel, candles burned, and the air was thick with incense. The door slammed shut just as the first cavalryman reached the steps. Outside, hooves scraped stone. Metal clanked. But inside, under the flickering gold light, a man with dust in his beard and two children wrapped in his arms stepped toward the altar, toward a chance to make them his, not by law but by love and God's witness. And the bell rang again, once, twice. Then a fist pounded the church door. The chapel was dim, lit only by the soft flicker of candlelight and the muted glow of morning filtering through stained glass. The air smelled of old wood, melted wax, and the faintest trace of sage. Outside, bootsteps echoed across the stone steps, urgent and gathering. But inside, time moved slower, measured not by fear, but by something deeper. Father Mendoza stood behind the altar, his white vestments flowing gently as he turned the pages of an old, leather-bound book. His hands were steady, voice calm, but his eyes never once left Gideon Hart. "You understand what this means," Mendoza said, low and firm. Gideon nodded. He stood tall, his arms resting lightly on the shoulders of the children before him. Samuel wore a collared shirt someone at the mission had loaned him. Little Bird had her hair tied back with a red ribbon Eliza had sewn from a scrap of cloth. They both stood proud. Not perfectly still, but still enough. "I've never been much for ceremony," Gideon admitted, "but I reckon there ain't no part of me that doesn't believe these two are mine." Eliza stood behind them, her hand pressed against her chest, clutching the documents that Sergeant Barnes had slipped them, the legal request for guardianship, co-signed by the mission and the priest. Mendoza gave a small nod, then dipped his fingers into the silver bowl before him. "Then let us begin." The ritual was simple, but every word landed with weight. The priest asked Gideon if he accepted the responsibility to raise these children as his own, morally, spiritually, and legally. "I do," Gideon said without hesitation. He knelt beside them, one hand on each child. "And do you, children, accept this man as your father?" Little Bird glanced at Samuel, then whispered, "He already is." The priest smiled. "And do you have names you wish to carry forward under his care?" Samuel stepped up. "Samuel Hart." Then Little Bird raised her chin. "I want to be Mary Hart." Eliza blinked hard, her lips trembling into a smile. Father Mendoza looked to Gideon, who nodded again. With careful reverence, Mendoza placed a hand on each child's head, anointing them in water and prayer. "I baptize you, Samuel Hart, and I baptize you, Mary Hart. May your names be a blessing, your lives a light, and your family a shield in this world." Outside, voices rose, metal clanged, the door rattled. But Mendoza didn't rush. He turned to his desk, opened the parish ledger, and with a thick black pen, he signed their names into the record. He pulled two legal documents forward pre-prepared, notarized, awaiting the final seal. He stamped both. Gideon took them, fingers trembling slightly as the sound of marching boots reached the threshold. Then the doors burst open. The light from the outside poured in like floodwater, blinding and sharp. A dozen soldiers stood in formation. Their commander, a clean-shaven lieutenant with silver pins, stepped forward, boots echoing in the holy space. "You are harboring 2 undocumented minors," the officer barked. "By Military Order 44, they are to be taken into federal custody pending placement in Fort Marlowe's youth detainment facility." Gideon didn't flinch. He stepped forward and handed over the stamped documents. "Not anymore," he said. "They're heart now. Church sealed, notarized, and legally adopted. You want to argue, go argue with God and the state of Texas." The lieutenant scanned the papers. His face tightened. Father Mendoza stepped beside Gideon, arms folded over his chest. "These children were baptized and registered under the protection of the church," he said. "And this man, under witness and the law, has claimed them as his own." The officer opened his mouth, then closed it. Another soldier whispered something in his ear. The lieutenant looked from Mendoza to Gideon, then to the children behind him, and finally to the crucifix above the altar. He nodded curtly. "Very well." He turned to his men. "Fall back." The soldiers filed out, leaving only the soft echo of boots on stone and the stunned silence that followed. The doors closed with a final thud. Inside, no one spoke for a long moment. Then Mary reached up and tugged Gideon's sleeve. "Does this mean we get to go home?" Gideon knelt down, pulled her and Samuel into his arms. "No," he said quietly. "It means you are home." The sun had fully risen when they rode back into Dry Creek. Gideon led Thunder slow through Main Street. Eliza walked beside the wagon, holding Mary's hand. Samuel sat tall on the back seat, waving now and then, his smile woe and unsure. And waiting for them, everyone. The baker with her apron still dusted in flour, the blacksmith with soot on his face, the schoolteacher, the old drunk, even the banker. They stood lined along the street, hats in hand, silent. Then, one by one, they began to clap. Slow, then louder. Not for a show, but for something stronger. For a man who took in 2 children when no one else would. For a woman who stood beside him when she could have walked away. For a family built not by blood, but by choice, and fight, and faith. And in the warm wind that swept through the dusty street, someone shouted the name loud and proud. "The Hearts are home!" But just beyond the hill, hidden in the hush of pines, Cain Maddox watched them from a distance, a rifle slung across his shoulder, and a letter in his pocket that would change everything. Dry Creek had never seen a morning quite like this one. The sun rose clean and proud above the rooftops, casting a golden haze over the main street. The bakery had opened early, and the smell of warm bread drifted through town like peace itself. For the first time in what felt like years, the air carried no whispers of fear. Just the quiet rhythm of people breathing easier, but not all men let go that easy. Cain Maddox rode into town just before noon, his horse cutting a sharp figure against the sun. Briggs sat behind him in a rickety wagon, holding a leather case in his lap. Both wore suits too fine for honest men in a place like this. They came not with rifles, but with paper. Outside the courthouse, the townsfolk had begun to gather. Word always traveled fast when Maddox rode in. Gideon stood in front of the steps with Eliza by his side, Mary holding her hand. Samuel watched from under the brim of his hat, his eyes narrowed. Cain dismounted with a calm smugness. He tipped his hat to no one. "I've got business with the sheriff," he announced. Sheriff Dunley stepped forward from inside the building, his badge polished, his face hard. "Then say it out loud, Cain." No more backroom dealings in Dry Creek. Cain smiled thinly. "Fair enough." He turned to the crowd and raised the folder high. "This is a land transfer agreement, ratified by the Central Western Railroad Company." filed just this week with the Territorial Land Office. Under Clause 8, Section 14 of Expansion Rights, the parcel known as Hart Ranch, formerly Whitlock land, is hereby forfeit due to inheritance confusion and improperly recorded transfer. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Gideon didn't move. Eliza did. She stepped forward, her voice steady and strong. My late husband willed that land to me, and now it belongs to the family I chose. Brigg laughed, thin and dry. Ma'am, no one's disputing your sorrow. But grief don't qualify as legal standing, especially when a certain man in your house wears no ring. That's when Sheriff Dunley stepped forward, unrolling a document of his own. Actually, he said, voice sharp, it does. Eliza Whitlock legally married Gideon Hart under state law, officiated and certified by Father Mendoza 2 days prior, witnessed by myself and Deputy Carr. He unrolled a second sheet. And as of that same morning, 2 minors, Mary Hart and Samuel Hart, have been officially adopted and registered under his guardianship. That means the land stays with the Hart family. Kane's jaw twitched. But the railroad? The railroad has no legal claim, the sheriff cut him off. The original deed was transferred and recorded by the county 2 months ago. You had no right to file those papers. Brigg opened his mouth, but Sheriff Dunley raised a hand again. There's more. He turned to the crowd. 3 years ago, Brigadier Orley was suspected in the theft of cattle from Wilkes Ranch, a few towns east. The case was dropped when the only witness went missing. That witness was found last week, alive, in El Paso, and ready to talk suddenly. It wasn't just paper in the air. It was justice. A rancher stepped forward, then another. Briggs got a long list of debts, one man muttered. Tried to bribe me to lie about a shipment. He threatened my boy, another added, last harvest season. The crowd tightened. Briggs' face paled. Kane took a step back. But he wasn't the man he once was. His arrogance wilted like a snake with a broken fang. He looked to the sheriff, then to Gideon. This ain't over, he muttered. Gideon looked him dead in the eye. You're right. It's just the part where we stop pretending you ever had a rightful place here. Kane turned without a word and mounted his horse. Brigg wasn't so lucky. Dunley gave the order and 2 deputies hauled him off, face first, to the jailhouse. The silence that followed felt like the end of a war. The townsfolk slowly turned to the Hart family, and for the first time no one looked at Gideon as an outsider. Not as a hired gun, not as the strange man who had taken over the Whitlock homestead. They looked at him as a father, as a husband, as a neighbor, as one of them. One by one, folks tipped their hats. Some clapped shoulders. A few of the children ran to Mary and Samuel and pulled them into play. Eliza watched it all with glassy eyes, her hand finding Gideon's without looking. We did it, she whispered. He nodded. We did. But just as they began to walk back toward their wagon, a rider appeared on the ridge, a lone figure with a black hat watching from the edge of town. The wind shifted, carrying dust and questions. Sheriff Dunley turned slowly toward Gideon. You expecting anyone else? Gideon squinted at the distant rider. No, he said quietly, but something tells me we just turned a page. And there's still a chapter left to write. 6 weeks had passed since the showdown in Dry Creek. The dust had settled. The jailhouse stood quiet. The Whitlock name had been retired on the ranch gate, and in its place, freshly carved into the wood with care and pride, were 4 simple letters. Hart. It was a Sunday morning, warm and bright. The bells of St. Miriam's rang out through the hills, calling the faithful to their pews and the wandering to something like hope. Inside the church, the congregation was larger than usual. Folks who had once turned their backs on Eliza were now saving her a seat. Those who had whispered about Gideon's past now nodded at him with respect. Change had come, not just to a family, but to the whole town. At the front pew, Eliza sat in a pale blue dress that caught the morning light like sky itself. Her hand rested gently on Gideon's knee. He didn't flinch from the touch anymore. He leaned into it. Samuel and Little Bird sat between them, fidgeting with nerves and pride. Each held a folded piece of paper close to their chest, clutching it like it was treasure. After the hymns and a soft sermon, Father Mendoza gave the floor to the children. "We've got two young writers in our midst," he said with a smile, "and I believe they have something to share." Samuel was first. He walked up slow, steady, his shoulders squaring just a little more than the last time he'd stood in front of a crowd. "My name," he began, voice clear but shaking, "used to be Samuel Whitlock. But that name didn't come with much choice. It came with ghosts." He unfolded his paper and read with a breath. "My name is Samuel Hart now. I chose it. Not because I had to, but because I got to, and because Gideon chose me first." There was a hush in the chapel, deep and sacred. Little Bird stood next, holding her paper tight in both hands. She didn't look at it. She just spoke. "My mama gave me a name when I was born. But she gave me something else too. Songs, feathers, fire. I kept that fire alive, and now I got a name that keeps me warm." She turned to the crowd, fierce and brave. "My name is Little Bird Hart. I picked it because it means I'm home now." The applause started slow, then filled the church like thunder. Father Mendoza wiped a tear from his cheek and nodded toward Gideon and Eliza, sitting in stunned silence. After the service, the family stepped outside into golden light. The town stood waiting, not with suspicion or judgment, but with pie, flowers, and open hearts. Eliza stood tall in her boots, smiling at the people she once feared. Gideon stood beside her, straighter than ever, not because he was trying to prove himself, but because he no longer had to. Samuel raced down the steps, grabbing Gideon's hand. "Can we go riding later?" "Just us men?" "Only if you saddle my horse," Gideon said, ruffling his hair. Little Bird was already running through the field, hair whipping in the wind. Her laughter danced above the grass. Gideon turned to Eliza. Their hands brushed. She looked at him, and this time there was no fear, no shame, no hiding. "Still feel like a man with no place?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "Amen," he said softly. For the first time in his long and lonesome life, Gideon Hart didn't feel alone. The town behind them buzzed with music and warmth. A boy and a girl had found their names. A woman had found her strength. And a man who once thought he was built only for war had finally found peace. But peace in the West is never permanent. Somewhere beyond the hills, far past the ranch and the river, new wheels were turning. A letter would arrive soon, sealed with a government crest. It carried a name Gideon hadn't heard in years, and with it a shadow from his past. But that's a story for another Sunday. Until then, may you ride true, love fierce, and never forget the power of a name. Subscribe to Western Legacy for tomorrow's story. A new tale waits just beyond the next ridge, and you won't want to miss what comes next.